So, the Papal States used to rule most of central Italy. The popes had been based in Rome for the most part since the city had an empire. But today, the last remnant of their country, Vatican City, consists of less than a square mile of land in the centre of the Italian capital. So then, what happened to the Papal States? What caused it to shrink? And why did one tiny piece survive? Well, the Papal States emerged in the 8th century out of the declining Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire's territories in Italy. Over the course of the next millennia, which covered the tenures of about 150 popes, the Papal States, like most countries in Italy which was not yet united, had ever-shifting borders. At times, it controlled barely anything outside of Rome and the surrounding countryside, while later popes owned places even outside of Italy. Avignon in southern France was a papal exclave for nearly 500 years, and for a few decades in the 14th century the popes lived there instead of in Rome. All the while, the Catholic Church, as it does today, owned property and extended its influence across the world, mostly elsewhere in Europe and later the Americas. But the beginning of the end for the Papal States also originated outside of the Italian peninsula with the French Revolution. Early revolutionaries were content to annex only Avignon in 1791, but as Europe descended into the War of the First Coalition, basically everyone v France round 1, a young French general named Napoleon Bonaparte led an invasion of Italy. He seized the northern Papal States, which would then become a part of a short-lived French puppet, the Cisalpine Republic. The rest, headed by Pope Pius VII, came under the influence of the French, but the Pope was constantly butting heads with Napoleon, who had risen to be France's first consul and in 1804 emperor, over the Church's rights in France, which had been curtailed since the Revolution. By 1809, Napoleon had had enough. He annexed the Papal States outright and exiled Pius VII. That was after he had presided over Napoleon's coronation. Of course, the First French Empire didn't last, and the Congress of Vienna, a summit attended by all of Europe's great powers which redrew the continent's borders post-Napoleon, chose to re-establish the Catholic Church's rule over all of the Italian territories it had held before the French Revolution, though France did keep Avignon. But the temporary toppling of French monarchy and the devastating wars that followed had set Europe ablaze as radical new ideas, most prominent among them liberalism and nationalism, spread outwards from France. In Italy, which was still split into several states, that resulted in calls for political unification, and there were some who, as Italians were predominantly Catholic, saw the Pope as the obvious choice to be leader of the prospective new country. Unfortunately for them, while it was initially quite a popular idea, reality soon caught up with neo-Guelphism and eroded its support. Pope Pius IX was a reactionary. He had no interest in abiding by liberal principles, and so when push came to shove, very few ordinary Italians were willing to rally around him or the Church as unifiers. In 1848, revolution again broke out across Europe, including in the Papal States. It briefly became the Republic of Rome, led by, among others, Giuseppe Mazzini, before troops of the Second French Republic restored the Pope. By the end of 1849, it had become clear that Italy, if it was going to unify at all, would do it under the leadership of the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia and its royal house of Savoy, which is exactly what ended up happening. By 1866, Piedmont-Sardinia, which now called itself the Kingdom of Italy, looked like this, but they couldn't take Rome. Why? Well, because France still said so, but 4 years later they became busy fighting Germans, not by the way for the last time, and so they had to withdraw their forces from the Papal States. Italy then marched in, virtually unopposed. So, with no one left to protect the Pope's country, why did Vatican City remain under his rule? Well, Pius IX, who was still Pope, holed up in the Vatican and was rather obstinate in his refusal to surrender. That put Italy in something of a rock and hard place situation. They wanted the bit of Rome they didn't yet control, but they couldn't risk alienating Catholic Italians by being too mean to Pius IX and storming the Vatican. So, stalemate. For 60 years, popes, of which there were 5, remained behind the walls of the Vatican and refused to recognize Italian authority. All the while, Italy claimed the Pope as a subject, albeit with some unusual privileges. But then something fairly rare in history happened. A fascist came along and resolved the problem, peacefully. Benito Mussolini became Prime Minister of Italy in 1925, and looking to make himself a bit more popular among Catholics, he recognized the Pope's authority over the Vatican, which would become a new microstate via the Lateran Treaty. Italy also handed over a chunk of cash as reparations for lost papal territory. For his part, Pius XI agreed to recognize Italy as a legitimate country, with Rome as its capital, and to be neutral on issues of Italian politics. He became Vatican City's first sovereign, and the first pope to step foot outside of it since the end of the Papal States. In the 90 years following the Lateran Treaty, despite regime change in Italy, a tiny city with global influence existing in the heart of Rome has stayed the status quo. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell below so you don't miss the next one. And as always, I've been James, and thank you for watching Look Back History.